Hello, everyone, and welcome to the My IVF Answers session on embryo grading tonight. It is lovely to have so many joining us live. I will also say we know that it is October 15th during Baby Loss Awareness Week, and there are a lot of people who are lighting their candles here at 7 p.m., which I have done as well. So our hearts are with you tonight if you also have a candle lit. Just for your awareness, this session is being recorded. However, your names will not be recorded. If you do post a question to the Q&A or in the chat, try to use the Q&A if possible. We'd love to get through as many questions as possible tonight. My name is Sandy Christiansen. I am a clinical embryologist by background and currently work as a fertility educator and advocate. I've been working in the fertility industry for over 16 years today. And joined tonight by two wonderful experts. Adéla, who is the director of Unica Prague. Would you like to introduce yourself first, please?
Thank you very much for having me here. It's been an honor. I'm working as the director of the clinic, but my original background is clinical embryologist. I started my career as a scientist. I was working on oocyte maturation, and then I switched to the field of IVF. And after several years in embryology and leading the few labs, I moved to the position of the embryologist. So our clinic is the part of the medical group, which includes 4 clinics. We have 1 clinic in Spain and 3 clinics in Czech Republic.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Adéla, and thank you for joining us tonight. And I'm also joined by Mafalda, who is the laboratory director of, I'm going to say this wrong, IERA Lisboa, possibly. Please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, Sandy. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm the director of the Human Reproduction Lab at IERA Lisboa. And I'm a certified clinical embryologist, senior level by ESHRE. And I also started my pathway in oocyte maturation, investigating these events. It was the easiest and, the forward path to take if we wanted to join this field of clinical embryology back then, because when we graduated, we had no formal path to go to be a clinical embryologist. So we just had to start investigating in the field, gaining knowledge, and then starting in some laboratory position, hands-on on the job to reach a logbook and to be able to perform the techniques. So I was very fortunate with my mentors. I passed almost 7 years in a private clinic in Lisbon. And then I moved to a public setting where I contacted with different cases, different people, bigger teams also. And 6 years ago, I was invited to join this project called IERA Lisboa. We are part of a larger group of Quirónsalud in Spain, and we are the first clinic out of Spain. And so now we are a multidisciplinary team, and I'm very fortunate to work with them. And on the side, I'm also an invited professor at the university and a co-founder of the Master of Clinical Embryology in Portugal. I love to teach and also to assist students. And it's our lovely job as embryologists.
Thank you so much. And it's funny, we were kind of touched on this a little bit backstage, but the pathways to becoming an embryologist are so different in each country. And a lot of, and I can say this because I started in Sweden, but a lot of the smaller countries don't necessarily have an established pathway within the university setting because there's maybe not necessarily the same need for the specialist degree. I mean, I think we can disagree with that now. We know what our guidelines say on how many cycles per year that we should be trying to perform per 100,000 in population. But it's funny how we kind of we find our own pathways to become these specialists in this field, and then it's lovely to see that decision gets made to be like, well, we should have a proper pathway, and let's make one ourselves. So that's really, really wonderful to see. The topic tonight is on embryo grading and processes. So I thought I'd just start off by maybe asking you to explain a little bit about, what embryo grading is and what kind of frameworks or kind of protocols or guidelines we work in in the laboratories, because there are different ones. So Adéla, I might start with you. In your laboratory, how often do the embryos get graded in general, if we start with that question?
Okay. So the first we start not from the embryo, but we start with the oocytes on the day when we do the punction of the follicles. So then we on the day 0, how we call it, we qualify the oocytes if it's ready for the maturation or not. So we are looking for the M2 stage oocytes. The next day, we do the scoring if the embryo is fertilized. So we are looking for pronuclei. So we generally want to see a 2 pronuclei. Then in our lab, we have 2 ways we can monitor the development of the embryo in time lapse. So we can see it anytime during the development, or we have an option if we use like a benchtop incubation. We look at the embryos on the day 3 of the development, so into 72 hours. So then we want to see the number of the cells, and then we assess the embryo on the day 5 when we have a blastocyst state. So we use the Gardner scoring. So we qualify how the blastocyst look, how look the part for the of the trophectoderm and the part of the embryoblast, which is for fetus in the future.
That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So the Gardner system is something that we as embryologists, I think, are very aware of. Not every clinic will follow that on the blastocyst stage, but essentially we're looking at 3 main features of the embryo. One is the expansion of the blastocyst itself, and then, as Adéla said, there are 2 different cell types in the blastocyst. There's the inner cell mass that will contribute to the fetus, and then the trophectoderm, which is that outer layer of cells which can help contribute to the placenta. And that's a set standard that everyone tries to follow, and as best as we can. There is still some subjectivity to it, but the Gardner system is one of the more renowned, I would say, and standardized types of scoring that we have available to us. And Mafalda, how about you? What do you see in your clinics? Are you also following Gardner? Do you have other scoring systems that you use?
Well, traditionally, being part of a Spanish group, we use the ACEVIR classification. ACEVIR is the Spanish Association of Embryologists, and they have been working for a lot of years with large number of embryos, large series of data, and they have came up with a systematic way of looking at the embryos and grading them day by day, starting also at the oocyte, but grading them day by day. But it is very similar to the Gardner system, grading system. It uses letters instead of numbers regarding the expansion rate. So a cavitated blastocyst would be a grade 1 blastocyst in the Gardner system, and the 6th grade, the fully hatched embryo, would be related to, we would say hatched, completely 100% hatched. But in the meantime, we have letters for the number. So the correspondence is very direct. It's a matter of utilization, and you're more familiar with using letters instead of numbers, and vice versa. And we also assess, of course, the fertilization at the regular timings and timing intervals, and we also use the time lapse. And for me, the change to the time lapse was like this leap to the moon. because I've come from, as I said, a private setting, but many years ago, 20 years ago almost, then to a public one, when we graded embryos, taking them out of the incubator, taking them to the microscope once a day. And sometimes we wanted to see them so much at the end of the day before leaving, but well, we had to resist not taking them from the incubator. And then in this new project at IERA, I was fortunate to have also time-lapse technology, and that taught us so much. We could, well, at the beginning, we couldn't keep ourselves from continually watching the videos and replaying and taking on another embryologist and look at what these embryos are doing, look at the cell division. So we gather a lot of information from the time lapse. It is a really wonderful technology and allow us as a boutique clinic that have to say that we are also to evaluate embryos every day, to also gather information so we can also have access to data that we can use in the future. Okay. And so we assess embryos every day, but we keep contact with patients on the same days, main days that Adéla mentioned, on the fertilization day, on the third day of development, because it is very informative that day, and decide whether to extend the culture or not until day 5, and then contact the patients at the blastocyst stage. So we are curious, we assess embryos continuously, but we keep contact in these most important days.
The main days. No, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I think for those who are joining who might not fully grasp the kind of the scientist in us that always want to like go back and look and see if an embryo on day 3 in the morning was maybe just a little early, maybe 5 or 6 cells, as it made it to 8 cells yet, and how we kind of have to resist doing that. You should just know and understand that, you know, we, as much as we want to, we don't want to disrupt the culture. So for the embryos that are, you know, in benchtop incubators or larger incubators, they hold the right temperature and pH based on the culture media that we're using, and a very, very specific oil overlay to keep that temperature and pH as, you know, close to what we would say in the uterus, or I guess at that time an early stage, possibly even in the fallopian tubes, as much as what would be in the body, you know, as equal and natural as possible. And anytime we move them around, there can be disruptions to that temperature that could have an impact on you know, further development of the embryo. So we do really need to resist the urge to move or disrupt them so much. So when time lapse came in, they could just be in the incubator the entire time and have a little camera take a picture of each embryo continuously, sometimes every 5 to 10 minutes, to give us all of that information without disrupting the culture. It was life-changing for us. And obviously from a laboratory point of view, it can really, really improve the efficiency of the lab. It can, you know, make things a lot easier for us embryologists. But also, Mafalda, to your point, the amount of data that we collect, the amount of information that we learn that can ultimately help us make the right choices in terms of selection and things like that, to help optimize the outcome of the cycle. It is really phenomenal. I'll ask Adéla first. When using time lapse, do you utilize any algorithms, things like that? Do you do any other type of scoring when looking at the embryos on day 5 before transfer, or you do mostly go off of the Gardner system?
Yes, this is also one of the advantages of the time lapse, not only like the self-education that we are able to look back how the embryo looks, how looks the development, and if it continues as a pregnancy and leads to the birth of the baby, but also it brings us the tool where we can do the scoring of the embryo which has the highest potential to implant. So there are many algorithms, many publications. There are also several programs which with the help of AI, just give you some score. Sometimes it's like a black box, so we don't know in detail exactly how do they score. But this is a great tool. Now we are working on a new setup in our labs. So my previous experience that we were using the algorithm like to help us to show if there's some situation with the embryologist wouldn't see if the embryo would be outside of the time lapse. And yeah, this is what I think that it will be like best practice in the future, that every lab would have its own algorithm or general algorithm to not only score with the Gardner and see this is the blastocyst with this classification, but also give you some information which embryo should be the first in line when we are planning the embryo transfer.
No, that's brilliant. And I think it's important to note with that, like you said, it's not just about getting information from the system. You're actually putting in data as well. So you need to track each individual embryo and the outcome of each one, whether it was a fresh embryo transfer or the ones that we have frozen, because they get labeled to the exact, well in the little dish that goes into the time-lapse incubator. So we know exactly which embryo, and that helps us not only follow outcomes, but it helps us create our own algorithms that are unique to our clinic, the culture media that we use, and the things that go on in our clinic. And that's what's really important. Yeah, sorry, you want to say something else?
That I also would like to mention. Remember, first time when I got the feedback from our gynecologist that the lady is expecting monozygotic twins, so we went back and look in the video to see how it looks. So this was one of the amazing things that we were really able to see what happened, and we saw the movie which leads to when the development of embryo leads to the monozygotic twins. So this is also interesting because if you see it like previously, you see it just in a one time in a microscope, then sometimes you are not sure if it's really like a two embryoblasts, like the two part of the cells which would lead to the two babies. But yeah, this is also the things which was great.
That's amazing. And Mafalda, how about you? Now you said you're not using Gardner, but you're using this Spanish version. Thank you. And do you use algorithms as well within the time lapse, or any additional scoring methods when you've got your embryos kind of being monitored all the time?
Yes, the Elsevier system, grading system, is not only for the blastocyst stage. Okay. It is a continuous evaluation of the embryo. So we use the morphological, the appearance of the embryo. So the number of cells, the size of the cells, the fragmentation, the little fragments that sometimes are liberated by the embryo, and the timing of the embryo, of the cell divisions, as well as an add to the classification of the embryos. So we take all the development in consideration when putting embryos by order, when there are more than one, by order of probability of implantation. And these time-lapse systems, besides the algorithms that can be built in the machine or studied with the data of the lab, they also help us embryologists do something very important, that is to look at the embryos, all the embryos at the same time, and all the data of the embryos in parallel. So we know that which embryo divided at the appropriate time. which embryo was too fast or too slow by comparison with the others. The time lapse that we use, we do not use the algorithm of the time lapse itself, but we have our own in-house data. And we know, for example, that we also had to adjust the timing of the observation of the cells of the embryo to the time lapse, because while putting maybe in simpler words, these classification systems, they tell us at what time of the day we should look at the embryos. And as embryos do not come out of the incubator, we learn with this that if they are not disturbed, they do not come out and in of the incubator, they could be a bit. So we also had to adjust our observations and our scoring system to our in-house results. And that is something that every lab has to do, because as you mentioned earlier, also the culture media that you are using, your in-house conditions will have an impact on the rate of the embryo development. So every lab should look at its own data and adjust. And we have new criteria coming out very soon. The new alpha consensus also with adjusted with this time points of time of observation adjusted to the time-lapse technology. The ASABIR also adapted these timings to the time-lapse. So we are always evolving. And also artificial intelligence, it's here. And we are trying some models. We have tried to have a system scoring the embryos, comparing to our scoring system. It is very reassuring to see that the machine still isn't always smarter than the embryologist. We have a good eye, but as Adéla was mentioning, I do believe that it will be the future, that little unperceptive movements and time points that the embryo will have on its development will only be observable, or it will be only evaluated by these programs. I think they will be a very interesting add-on to our work.
Definitely, yes. And I know we've seen AI is, of course, growing across all industries. It's been around, with the time lapse incubation systems for quite a while, but there are now multiple algorithms. There are multiple different types of AI that can be kind of plugged into what we're currently using. And yeah, I've also seen some recent publications just state that, embryologists are still a little bit better, but that could change, and it could change very quickly, because at the rate that this is just growing, we know that things
definitely, like AI right now with another colleague in your lab, so this is a great thing, that it's not that should replace you right now, but just it's like another person in the lab who can tell you, hey, look, this embryo with this embryo could be something wrong, or something unusual, so you should be careful. So this is a great tool.
It can be particularly reassuring if you are working in maybe a smaller clinic, if you're the only embryologist in the laboratory choosing embryos for embryo transfer, just to have your little, like you say, it's like another colleague just backing you up. Yes, this is a good choice. We do have a question that's come in here from the Q&A. So I'll start with you, Adéla. What do you think? Before choosing a clinic, should we ask whether they use time-lapse technology for embryo monitoring? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think?
I don't think so. Generally, I think the embryologists were here like before, and if they have good conditions and they're confident with their work, so you don't need a time lapse. The time lapse is still the incubator, but this could be a nice tool if you have some long history without the pregnancy or without having a child. So this could be a nice tool to, in some cases, to look in the details what is going on, because sometimes we can see more than from the benchtop incubators. So I don't think that this is the main criteria to choose the clinic if they have a time lapse or not, but it's nice to have if they have.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. It kind of also depends on your history, your kind of full journey of trying to conceive, and where what you've done so far. So possibly not always a necessity. Mafalda, what do you think?
Yes, I share Adéla's opinion. I think it should not be a decision criteria from start, but and also because time lapse has helped to elucidate some gray areas of the embryo development and embryo classification. So even clinics that do not have time lapse, they have benefited from all the knowledge that this technology gave us as embryologists and added some knowledge to those who do not have access to the technology. But yes, the benchtop incubators, these are incubators where your embryos will be placed in a very, very small chamber. And so the ambience around the embryos will be very, very controlled. Even benchtop incubators that do not have the time lapse, do not have the video to capture the images, will give you another level of quality, as if I can say, to the embryo development or assurance. But really, in cases where there are low number of oocytes, a low reserve, or a history of infertility, or a history of aneuploidy, for example, if you are going for a PGTA, for example, it could be very useful to access the images, the complete 24/7 hours of images of the embryo, because we now know that sometimes micropronuclei appear being perceived as a third pronuclei, like if it was a third set of chromosomes that shouldn't be there. And now we know by time lapse and PGTA also that sometimes that is not the case. And time lapse could, or I would not say time lapse, I would say access to these videos, to these images will give us and the patient the opportunity to maybe consider some embryos that otherwise could be discarded, or sometimes embryos that seem to have an incomplete fertilization. They show some sign of fertilization, but not all the sign. They show the two little cells, the peripheral cells that appear after fertilization, but they do not show the nuclei. And if we do not access the images of the time lapse, they could have disappeared earlier and we will miss that. So in particular cases, there is I think a very good benefit of having that. And also some patients, they have some particularity that make their embryos more prone to stress during culture. And time lapse, these kind of incubators, they are really, really very stable, and they could help bring down the stress a little bit, not per se, but if we add all the bits of stress that the gametes and the embryos go through during the process, at the end we will have a sum of stress. And if we could somehow in some parts diminish that stress, maybe that could be help in a particular case.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your answers, and thank you for the brilliant question. And please feel free to continue dropping your questions in the Q&A. I do think it's important to note, because I think what I said, as embryologists, scientists, we love time lapse, right? It can do so much for us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's best for the patient always. Mm-hmm. We love it. We can gather more data. I could watch videos of embryos develop all day long. It's quite a beautiful thing. It's fascinating, but that doesn't always mean that it's in the patient's best interest to have. So brilliant answers. Thank you so much. And in terms of kind of, assessing the best embryos for transfer, do you kind of score those embryos multiple times and kind of follow initial, I guess, theories, or on day 3, if you're scoring embryos and you've got like a beautiful 8 cell, 0 fragmentation, everything is symmetrical and lovely, do you tend to put a pre-prediction on your grading sheets then before you reach day 5? How do you kind of work in the laboratory, Adéla? Do you do anything like that, or do you kind of wait until the day of transfer?
This also depends if you're scoring the embryos from the time lapse, or if you're working from like a group cultivation. So if you use the time lapse, definitely, if you have some experience, you can somehow predict the potential of the embryo to develop to the blastocyst. So as Mafalda mentioned, the proper timing of some divisions and the number of cells and everything can predict the quality of the embryo. If you have a group culture and you score it on the day 3 and then day 4 or day 5, so sometimes it's a little bit more difficult because you are not all the time sure that is the proper embryo. If you do the single cultivation of the embryo, still the number of the cells and if the cells are nice or if the embryo has some fragmentation, you can also predict the quality of the blastocyst. Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. And you've highlighted something that I've forgotten, because I think in the majority of laboratories that I've worked in, at least, we've done single cultivation. I don't think I've done group cultivation since I started back in 2009, and we only did that for a few years before we moved to single. So thank you very much for highlighting that. Mafalda, how about you? Do you kind of, because all I see really here is just the ability to kind of like challenge the algorithms and challenge AI a little bit, is, can we as embryologists predict things a little bit sooner? Do you have a method where you do that with your grading system? Because you look at multiple factors, I'm guessing that might be a yes.
Yes, we do. As we inform patients on the 3rd day of development, we also have a very short briefing saying, well, we'll use this grading system that is with letters from A to D. A's and B's are the best. C's are intermediate. We consider them, well, a bit of a black box. We don't know how good they will develop. But and D's, they are the ones that have some direct division and, well, have this kind of divisions that will that tell us that they will arrest development, for example, or if they have a very high fragmentation, they are blocked their development for 24 hours, something like that. So it is very straightforward. A's and B's the best, C is the intermediate, D to discard, for example. And we have this. We can, as embryos came out as a grade A and B, we already know that these are the embryos that have a higher chance of reaching the blastocyst stage, and that will also depend on the age of the woman or the oocyte and the male factor. For example, the age of the male partner, if it's a donor partner or not, the fragmentation index that we also assess, for example, or the infertility, the male infertility per se. So we already know as embryologists that if a day 3 embryo is a grade A or B and a young patient with a non-male infertility factor, there will be a higher chance of reaching the blastocyst stage. And on the contrary, if we have a patient, an older woman, older oocytes, and a male infertility factor, we have a risk of developmental arrests from the 3rd day of development on. We classically say that the male genome comes into action from the 3rd to the 4th day. Now we know the influence of the male partner of the spermatozoa. It is very much earlier, but classically, and as an easier way to inform the patients, we use these guidelines. And so we know that we have to be a bit more careful in advising patients or discussing the probabilities to reach the blastocyst stage if we have these factors, these risk factors. But if it is a very lovely 8-cell embryo on the 3rd day with not a very, heavy infertility factor on the male side, also we will have a more higher chance of having a blastocyst. And inclusively, we tend to extend the culture to the blastocyst stage, but at some cases we discuss directly with the patient if that is the option that best serves the cycle, the patient and the interest on that cycle. Because in our hands, we see there are some patients that if they already have the embryo to transfer on the 3rd day chosen, there is no need to reach the blastocyst stage just to see what happens. Because I believe it is not a direct relation. If the embryo, telling patients that if the embryo doesn't develop in culture, it would have arrested in the uterus if it was transferred earlier. So for most of the times, that is what would happen. But for a specific set group of patients, I believe that that is not 100% true. So we could have this conversation if we inform the patients correctly, and if they are aware of all these things that we are looking at, I think we can have a discussion with them and see what would be best for them. If go to the extended culture, if to transfer earlier, if to transfer on a day 3 the best embryos and see what happens with the others. So there is a lot of different strategies that we can also adapt and help the clinical side to guide the patient as the best as we can.
I definitely agree with Mafalda. We have the same approach. Like this has to be on a balance. So if you have a special patient who can somehow benefit, or if you know that their embryos reach the blastocyst stage and the development of the embryo is nice, then you can do the transfer on the day 3, and you don't need to wait till the blastocyst stage.
No, absolutely. And that's a good point that you've highlighted as well. We've kind of been talking around this and the assumption that all embryos get transferred on day 5, and that's obviously not the case. And to your point, there are those who've gone through multiple transfers with beautiful blastocysts and have not had any pregnancy. They've got a transfer on day 3, and that was somehow the magic trick to do it, and it's not always something that we can explain. We've had a couple of questions come in now, slightly unrelated to the grading, but Adéla, if you wouldn't mind, this question here: do you always recommend PGTA? This person has had 4 failed euploid transfers, and the theory is that maybe they don't cope well with the interference of the biopsy procedure.
The PGTA is a great tool if you have an older patient, but I do not recommend it to all of them if you have a one embryo. So it's again about the balance. So you have to know the history. If we are talking about the patient who had implantation failure of the 4 euploid embryos, there is maybe more the question about the gynecologist or the IVF specialist, if there is no different reason. So probably the implantation failure or immunological things and so on. So on one hand, the PGTA as a screening. So we're looking at the euploidity, but there also could be some other reasons. Also from the genetic point, it could be some genetic diseases which we couldn't see through the PGTA. So this is maybe more the question for the IVF specialist.
It's a really hard thing to go through for transfers that have not ended in a positive pregnancy. So I'm so sorry that's been your experience. And with transfers or any kind of pregnancy in general, there's so many factors at play in conception. So it is the embryo, the genetic markup of that embryo, even the quality of the embryo, if it can continue to develop when it's been transferred into the uterus, the uterine environment, internal hormone levels. There's so many things that can have an impact on that. So it's not necessarily always recommended, but it could mean that now could be a good time to go back and evaluate some of the other factors that are involved in implantation and not just focus on the embryo itself. So I hope that makes sense. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Mafalda?
Well, we also do not recommend PGTA for all. Portugal has a more restrictive law regarding the PGTA related to Spain. The UK, I really do not know if there is a limit of age to start PGTA with, or if it is a clinical decision. I guess you are telling me no, Sandy, there is no. But in Portugal, we are allowed to propose PGTA to patients over 37 years old or who have a history, a repeated implantation failure or previous abortions. So under the age of 37, I don't know if it's the case or not. Under the age of 37, there is a higher probability of having euploid embryos. If that is the case, and frequently, or if this is a cohort of embryos that came from the same treatment and the rate of euploidy was very high, maybe it could be time to reassess the strategy. Maybe you could discuss that. But of course, the uterine environment is very, very, very important. It is very important to assess, for example, like with an hysteroscopy, with to see if there is an endometritis, to see if there is some adenomyosis that could be unnoticed, some alteration of the microbiome, the immunology area, as Adéla mentioned also. So there is a very large number of things that have to be assessed, and not only the embryo. And well, it is a really a difficult case for embryos, euploid embryos transferred. Well, it is a difficult case.
It is. It definitely is. And thank you both so much for that. Yeah, I think it is, there's just so much that can be involved in implantation. So sometimes going back and reevaluating those other factors that can influence could be a good place to start. But to your question earlier, Mafalda, no, there's no regulation for PGTA here in the UK. In Sweden, where I started, it's also not allowed. But here, the guidelines generally do also say, if you're 37 or older, if you've had recurrent implantation failure or recurrent miscarriages, then it could be considered. But essentially, if you want it, and if you can pay for it because it is an expensive treatment add-on, then it can be available to you. We've got another question here, somebody who's doing a master's thesis, which is exploring differences in blastocyst ploidy based on PGTA, if that is reflected in morphology or time-lapse parameters. And in your experience, do we see any correlation between ploidy and embryo grading? Adéla, would you like to start with the smile? $1 million question here. This is what we've been trying to work on since time lapses came to us. But
I think this is a question for every embryology or IVF meeting. So this is the main topic for all of us.
Always.
And this is as we already talked about the AI. This is the things which brings a lot of information and a lot of visions for the future. But nowadays there are many tools which could try to predict the correlation between euploidity and morphology and so on. I haven't seen the tool which till now which could really tells me that it really works, because it needs a lot of information, and this information has to somehow correlate also with the live birth. Like it means that it could be nice if we would have a tool which could works with at least a million of the babies or million of the embryos where we know the euploidity. But till now I haven't seen any tools, because those programs are based on the study with 10,000 embryos or 50,000 embryos, but still, from my point, it's not strong enough to predict.
Yeah, that's a great question and lovely answer, Adéla. Thank you. Mafalda, what are your thoughts?
Yes, regarding the artificial systems, the artificial intelligence, I think we are not there yet. There are some programs that approach the subject, and they have some viability studies and data that haven't. They try to reach the identification of the aneuploid embryos, but they are really not there yet. But what I was thinking about was more about the triploid embryos, for example, or the 1PN embryos, that we really see that if, for example, 1PN is a true 1PN, and for everyone who is listening to us, it's like seeing an oocyte fertilized with just one nucleus. That would be unnatural, but we might think that this one nucleus could have all the female and male chromosomes fused earlier than it should, and appears as one instead of two. But if it really is a one nuclei embryo, it will arrest somehow, and we will see a difference in the morphokinetics of the embryo with the time lapse by itself, not using artificial intelligence. On the other way, the 3 pronuclei embryos, for example, an oocyte that was fertilized by 2 sperm in a fertilization, a classic in vitro fertilization, or an oocyte that did not get rid of those extra chromosomes that it has to do before the embryo development, will have 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2, and those will be very fast and very beautiful, but will not implant. And we will see those differences on the time lapse marking points as well. So if there's interest on a thesis for that is a way to go.
Definitely. Thank you both so much. Another question here. Adéla, if we start with you, is there any difference to the monitoring or management of embryos if they're going to be PGTA tested or if they're going to be transferred in a fresh transfer? So in the laboratory, are your processes different if you do PGTA testing or a fresh transfer?
No, the culture is the same. So because what we do, the final decision is on day 5 generally, especially if you have more embryo. It's also the option some patients has decided if they have a few embryos and we don't need if they reach the blastocyst or stage, or if they are only one embryo which has potential to develop in one blastocyst. So then we again have to find a balance. So sometimes we can make decision on the day 5 if we are going to do the transfer or if we are going to do the PGTA. So this is again about the discussion with the patient, about the history, about the if they already had some embryos. So in some cases, I would prefer to do the fresh transfer instead of doing the PGTA because PGTA anyway, it's an invasive process. So even if we are very gently, if we know how we work with the embryo, still sometimes it's easier or better to do the transfer or not to do the testing.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and thank you for your answer. I think typically speaking, the process in the laboratory will always be the same, but sometimes the communication with the patient can differ. Sometimes for those who are going for a fresh transfer, they'll get more updates from the lab. This is what we have on day 3, and like this is when you can expect your transfer. If you're going for PGTA testing, in many cases, I've worked in clinics where you get the number of embryos you've got fertilized, and then you'll get a call on day 6, so you know how many we've done. And so that could be the one difference, but typically in the laboratory, it would be the same process. Mafalda, I've got a question for you here. When you talk about a day 3 transfer, would that be a fresh transfer only, or could you biopsy, test, and freeze on day 3 as well?
Well, day 3 transfers could be fresh or frozen, but we do not biopsy on day 3. We have abandoned the technique in Portugal for some years ago, not only at IERA, but day 3 biopsies were technically very challenging, more harmful to the embryo than at the blastocyst stage, and the information that they gave us were also confusing, because if we had mosaics, it was very hard to manage that information and to compare that information to the one that we have nowadays with the reports on mosaicism on day 5. So we do not biopsy on day 3. We could freeze these embryos and not transfer them fresh because of the hormonal levels of the estradiol that the woman reached during the stimulation, or the progesterone. If those levels are elevated over a certain level, we postpone the transfer for the next cycle, and we prepare the endometrium, the uterus, for a day 3 transfer to synchronize the uterus with a day 3 embryo. That is an option. We also use that strategy, going a bit back to the previous question. We also use that strategy if we want to accumulate embryos for PGTA, because as in Portugal we have this restriction on the age. It is more likely that patients need a higher number of embryos to be biopsied to reach one euploid blastocyst. Yeah. So we tend to, in certain cases of smaller reserve, of lower number of oocytes, to accumulate embryos on day 3, cycle by cycle, 2 or 3 cycles of stimulation, and on the last cycle that we have those embryos on that 3rd day of development, we thaw the ones that we have already and take them all together to culture until day 5, biopsy them in one round to elevate the chances of an euploid embryo. That is one of the strategies that we also use for PGTA.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, we used to do day 3 biopsies, but it is not common practice anymore.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Adéla, I've got a question for you. This person says, yesterday I had 6 embryos frozen on day 5, but I'm disheartened as they seem to be low grade. Should I still transfer in the future? So this is from someone who used an egg donor and had a semen sample with morphology of number 2. There are a lot of grades here I'm going to read at you. So okay. they've got a 3 BC, a 3 CC, a few 2 BC, and a 1 BC. And so they're just asking, should they still transfer in the future?
I don't know if I understand properly the question.
Yeah. Basically, I think they're just feeling a bit sad because the embryo grades seem low because they had a 23-year-old egg donor. So they're wondering if it's still worth doing a transfer in the future when they've got these embryos that have grade C within them. What are your thoughts on that?
Grade C, it's our strategy in our lab is that if we have these embryo on day 5, we generally keep them in culture till the day 6, because we want to see if they increase the number of the cells, if they have a potential to develop. We know that the embryos from a day 6 has a lower implantation potential, but we want to see the difference between day 5 and between day 6. So with the grading C in the trophic cells, these embryos definitely have a lower potential to implant because there is not enough of the cells. So you can do the transfer, and in our case, if it's what we have a strategy in our lab, if it's from donor cells, we generally don't freeze these embryo if we don't see the potential there.
I think that's a good point. So if they don't have the potential, then they wouldn't be frozen in the first place. So I would take that they still have the potential, and I can appreciate that you feel worried, but it's not all down to the grade. And I think that's an important thing to bring up on this embryo grading process session. The grade isn't everything when it comes.
On the other hand, I saw a few beautiful kids who were from the embryos, which were classified as 3 BC, and I wouldn't expect that they will really develop, but now they are big kids and they're running around, and so sometimes it's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your question. Mafalda, this one is directed to you regarding the hysteroscopy that we talked about before. That previous question about either recurrent implantation failure. I do think this was in regards to those 4 euploid embryo transfers. Can one biopsy cover everything? They've already done an Emma and Alice and an IERA. What else could be tested? And they've heard something about chronic inflammation. So one of the things to note is a hysteroscopy is not necessarily a biopsy of the uterus. Sometimes the screening hysteroscopy, basically they go in with cameras to look inside the uterus to see if there's something else there that can't be picked up on an ultrasound scan. But Mafalda, what other things do you think could be tested then? And I guess with the inflammation, we'll get into a whole world of reproductive immunology that could go on for ages. But generally speaking, what other things could be looked at?
Well, generally speaking, if an IERA test already has been done, if I understood, it has. Maybe there is a second and third part of the IERA test, a complementary part of that test, and that is called the endometrio. And it is from the same commercial genetic lab, and it also looks at signs of chronic inflammation or dysbiosis. I am not an expert. I just take part of the clinical sessions that we do daily with our patient cases, and that is what generally accompanies the IERA test. The immunology area, it's it's a world. It's a very, very specific area. We do have immunology appointments, and I will not say a word about that because it is very, very complex. It is case by case. It includes some genetic specific types that the oocyte has and the sperm has, saying that the male and the female part have, and it really has to be assessed on an immunology appointment. The hysteroscopy by itself, it's an easy procedure, as Sandy said. It uses a video camera, a micro video camera that is placed inside the uterus and looks at some deformities, some polyps, some endometrioma, some growths of the uterus outside of place that could interfere with the implantation of the embryo if those areas, those altered areas or inflammation sites, direct inflammation sites of the uterus are occupying the space that the embryo needs to implant, it could difficult the implantation. There is some specific and considered an add-on at the ESHRE guidelines, the European Society of Embryology, that they also advise or they not advise. They say it is a plausible add-on to use a specific media for embryo transfer that have, for example, a high content of hyaluronic acids. Well, there is a whole world of implantation failure evaluation, and this kind of pinpoints the main areas, I think.
Exactly. And that, to your point, ESHRE has guidelines on recurrent miscarriage and recurrent implantation failure, and they've got the investigations divided into different sections. So what's recommended, what could be looked into, and things that they don't recommend. And I think sometimes, it's even simple things like evaluation of lifestyle factors, definitely a reevaluation of the uterine environment. So sometimes that screening hysteroscopy can be looked into. Other things are thyroid hormones. Like, there are a lot of things that can influence our reproductive hormones in general. So I don't remember them all, but there's I can see it in front of me that the green, the yellow, and the red, and these are the things that can be considered. But yeah, reproductive immunology is an entire field, and we will not get into that tonight. We've got another question that's come in. Thank you both so much for all your answers so far. And this has been great to have so many wonderful questions come in. Thank you, everyone. So someone has now asked, can we transfer the best looking embryo on day 3 and then possibly freeze and test or test the rest at day 5? Is the question. Adéla, what are your thoughts on that?
It's absolutely okay. We also have some patients when we transfer the embryo on day 5 and the freeze and test the rest of them. So it's still the option. So it's also about the IVF. It's all about the team in your clinic. So it's about the communication between the patient, the IVF specialist, and the embryologist. So it's no problem to do that. Yeah.
Definitely. Mafalda, any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't thought about that ever, but yes, it is a possibility. We haven't been asked to discuss, and sometimes patients really have these ideas, these thoughts of what would be best for them, and we always learn from them. At least they defy us to think about things, and that is a very good question. I would not object on that. I don't think any clinician would, except if the age of the woman is, I would say, above 43, I think. Because our law allows us to treat women until the age of 50 years old, and at our clinic, after 38, we always inform about PGTA. we not advise directly, but we inform. And if patients are 41, 42 or above, in those cases we really advise, because we know the probability of an embryo for transfer, an euploid embryo, is low. So on that case, it would have to be discussed, I think, with the medical team. But if the woman is older than 43, maybe it wouldn't have a clinical efficiency. And we also have to discuss this openly with patients. What is the emotional versus economic burden of some of their thoughts and decisions? If they are really well informed and it does not pose a risk for the baby or the mother, well, it could be a shared decision. Yes.
I think you both touched on something really lovely here, because I think, IVF is a medical treatment that is a necessity for some people, but there is a lot of decision making for the patients, and sometimes they're not just a patient, they're also a consumer. They're paying for their treatment, and there are multiple factors that need to be taken into consideration there, like what's medically suitable, what can be done, what's best practice, what's what's the best thing for you with the possible best outcome, and balancing that with the patient's wants or needs, and making sure, to your point, if everyone is well informed and can make a decision that's not going to have a negative impact on the outcome of the treatment, then there are these different ways that we can accommodate treatment for them. So yeah, I really liked that. That was all of our questions this evening. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions tonight. And apologies for those who've gone through such difficult treatments. I know it's not easy, but so pleased that you could join us tonight, and I hope you've benefited from getting to ask your questions to the experts today. Mafalda, Adéla, thank you so much both for your time. It's been really lovely having you both here tonight, and listening to your practices and your clinics. So thank you so much. For those who have attended and want to revisit this, like I said, this has been recorded, and you should get an email tomorrow if you want to rewatch, or if you needed to jump off and on and missed any part of it tonight. So you'll get an email from my IVF Answers. We will be back towards the end of November. I believe it's the 26th of November. And so just keep an eye as we get the next set of experts to join us, then the sign up will go live. So do be sure to sign up to the newsletter so you get all of the notifications from us. And yeah, have a lovely rest of your evening, everyone. And thanks so much again.
Thank you,
Sandy.
Thank you. Lovely having you both, Adéla, Mafalda. Have a great night. Take care.
Take care.